Okay, so why don't we get started? Thank you so much for coming to the SNU UC San Diego, the joint webinar series. So today we are very glad to have Professor Minchul Yum and Professor Minki Kim as a presenter and discussant for very important issue in Korea, East Asia, and in the world about the low birth rate. And his paper will be about the status externalities in education and its contribution to the lowest birth rate in the world, in South Korea these days. So let me quickly introduce today's presenter and the discussant. So today's presenter is Professor Minchul Yum, who is the Associate Professor in Economics at the University of Southampton and the Research Affiliate at the Center for Economic Policy and Research, CEPR. So he was an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Mannheim before joining the U of Southampton. So his research interest lies primarily in macroeconomics, family economics, and public economics. Our discussant today is Professor Minki Kim. He is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Mannheim and a member of Collaborative Research Center Transregio, the 224. His research focuses on macroeconomics, growth, development, and labor. He received his PhD in economics from UC San Diego the last year. Welcome back to the UC San Diego event.
Glad to be back here.
All right, so without the further ado, so today we will have a 25 minutes presentation and 15 minutes the discussion. So during the presentation, if you have any questions, please leave your questions on the Q&A box on the Zoom. Again, you can leave your questions anytime on the Q&A box. And then if those are the clarifying questions, I will deliver during the presentation to the presenter, or we will have about 20 minutes the Q&A at the end. Okay, so let's get started. Professor Minchul Yum, floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very glad to talk about this paper, my recent paper about Korean fertility and education in fever. So this is a joint work with Sang Kim, who is at Sejong University in Korea, and Michel Tertil, who was my colleague at the University of Mannheim. And so let me. I only have like 25 to 30 minutes, so this is gonna be more like snapshot of the paper. So for the details, please take a look at the paper. So I'm gonna be skip through some of the details. So this paper is motivated by two distinguishing features in South Korea, or more generally in East Asia. So one of them is this so-called education fever. So the participation rate for private education after school is very high. So annually, this rate is about 75%. So if you aggregate them up over the childhood, I mean, this rate is obviously like close to 100%. So almost all kids, they go to this private education center after school, and actually they are quite expensive. So compared to European countries, for example, they are heavy burden to parents. Okay? But at the same time, the fertility rate is very low in these countries, especially South Korea is now like one lowest in the world, right? So our big picture question in this paper is like, how could these two phenomena be related? And if so, what are the policy implications? So if you know the literature, clearly they should be connected through quantity-quality trade-off. But the question is, does it mean that there's too much education that can cause too little fertility, right? So if you look at the literature, there are a few papers on the normative studies on low fertility, and our paper tries to argue that there is some distortion that can lead to inefficiency and like fertility choices. Okay, and we argue that this is driven by this parents' obsession with relative education in their kids. So what I mean by that, in Korea, is quite common. This is quite commonly observed that the parents, they care a lot about their kids' education relative to their others, like peers, or it can be actually compared to all children in the in the entire the society, because I will explain what could be the source of this, but in our paper, we will try to argue that regardless of the source of this, if there is such phenomena, then that can lead to that will have some normative implication for low fertility. Okay, and this is a quick quote from like Financial Times saying that this woman chooses not to have kid because she cannot afford expensive private education, and and then if everyone else does, then she's kind of forced to send their kids, but because they are so expensive, she ends up choosing not to have kids, right? So this is kind of story we try to formally investigate in this paper. Okay, so this is the outline of the paper. So I'm going to quickly show some empirical evidence on private education and fertility in Korea. And then I'm going to analyze this connection in a structural model where education, parental investment, and fertility choices are endogenous. Okay, and then the novel ingredient will be this so-called status externality in education. So this, we will try to reflect this phenomena that the parents, they care about their children's relative standing. Okay, and then this is a quantitative paper, so we will try to calibrate the model to Korean economy, okay, and mostly based on the empirical evidence I talk about here. And using the model, we are going to explore the role of externality. That's the first exercise I'm going to do. So we are going to conduct like very counterfactual exercise where we try to eliminate the externality and see what will change, like fertility, education, investment, how they will change, especially across like income distribution. Okay, so that's going to be the first exercise. And then in the second set of exercise, we will ask, like, what if they are kind of features that cannot be fixed in the short run? So what we can do is like think about like typical government policies. So take them as given, take the externality, present some externality as given, and what can government do improve the situation? Okay, so to do that, we are going to consider two very common policy tools to address this externality, and we are going to ask both positive and normative question. Okay, so this is like a broad picture, like broad outline of this paper. So let me quickly move on to the empirical evidence. So our empirical evidence is mostly based on this CLIFS called stands for Korea Labor Income Panel Study. So this is like PSID in the US. So this is annually conducted on a sample of about 5,000 household members. We pulled 20 waves, and then we use our baseline sample uses only the waves after 2009 because it became nationally representative after 2009. Okay, and then we focus on this cohort of women born in 1970 to 75. Okay, and this is kind of the most recent cohort we can have who finish the fertility choices. Okay, so this is kind of compromise. So what are the key variables we are going to look at? The first variable is going to be fertility. So in this empirical analysis, we are going to look at completed fertility, not like a total fertility rate. So completed fertility is simply like number of children ever born. Okay, and this is what I'm going to show you. And what about income? So for income, we are going to have more broad measure of income, which will reflect like some economic status of family in the long term. So it's not going to be like short-term income, right? So to do that, what we do is we add like earnings from both like women and men, because we are going to focus on this married or cohabiting women. Okay? And but by the way, these samples account for about like 97% of our total samples. So we're not dropping like a lot of samples by focusing on these more stable samples. So we add earnings from these both members and also capital income. Okay, so and then furthermore we take the average when the woman's age belongs to this like more like prime age. Okay, so this is not about like their income information when they actually have kids, right? Because that's gonna mechanically introduce some relationship between income and fertility. So this is rather more like long-term family income. So the first picture I'm going to show you is the relationship between these two. So this is just descriptive relationship between the two. And here you see that in Korea, actually the more the richer families, they tend to have more kids. In other words, like poorer families have fewer kids. And this is actually quite different from, for example, the US, where my co-author has looked at the historical like fertility income relationship over time. And I mean, in the US, this has become more flatter in recent periods, but still relationship is still negative, right? But in Korea, you see that this income fertility relationship is rather positive. Okay, and we show that in the paper that this is not particularly driven by like either intensive or extensive margins. So this is driven by both margins. Okay, so this is just a descriptive evidence that kind of suggests that the low fertility might be more likely to be related to like economic region, right? So compared to the US, for example. So then what we do next is actually to try to estimate some more like causal evidence on spillovers I talked about. Okay, so like if my for example, if other parents spend more, then are there any spillover effects on my like own investment behavior, right? So this is what we want to formally estimate, which is actually based on a lot of anecdotal evidence. So basically, what we want to do is to estimate this spillover effect. So if like a relatively high socioeconomic status, they spend more, then what will be the impact on relatively low socioeconomic status, like families spending in private education? Okay, but obviously these two are going to be endogenous if you can't just run this regression. So to address this endogeneity, we use this instrumental variable approach. So what we are going to exploit is the change of this late night Hagwon curfews. So what do I mean by Hagwon curfews? So Hagwon is the name of the Korean name of the private education like centers, like institutions after school. Okay, so this Hagwon usually starts from like after school time, like 5 p.m., 6 p.m., and then it can actually last up to like 11, 12 p.m., but potentially like after 12 p.m., right? But the Korean government has been worried about this high demand for this private education, so they introduced curfews after which these Hagwons cannot operate. Okay, and then this introduction was actually there was some variations across different provinces, and the timing of this becoming like strengths, this curfews being strengths has been different like along this time period. So we are going to use this variation as an instrument, okay, and then use these curfews, like how they affected like high SES family spending, and then use this to estimate our eventual interest of this effect, spillover effect. Okay, So this is like what we do verbally, in a mathematical integrations, like we can express this in two-stage least square in this way. Okay, so in the first stage, we have this regional spending among the relatively high SES families, and we have these two curfew variables. And then our eventual interest is how these affected the individual among the relatively poor household, how they spend, how their spending behavior changed. Okay, so this beta is what we are interested in. Then obviously we need to ask whether this instrument is valid, right? So we we need to check whether these instruments are relevant, and we also need to check these exclusion restrictions. So for the relevance, we should have a negative effect of these curfew changes on regional spending among rich families, right? For that, actually, we might encounter like weak IVs in our actual practical application, because if we focus on like very top income group, like let's say like top 5%, the number of sample becomes too low. So actually we got like a low F-stat. So that was not ideal. But if we try to increase the sample and consider like the top 50%, for example, then because these curfews only affected relatively like a richer people, very small number of people, then this the instrument became also weaker. So this top 15% was kind of like compromise we ended up using. Okay, and this is yeah. So that I'm gonna show you here like how many people were potentially affected by these curfew changes. Okay? We don't have a direct evidence because our baseline sample don't have a time use survey, but we use like external, like different survey data to have some kind of indirect evidence. Okay, and you might be also worried that these curfew changes were policy responses, maybe policy responses to, pre-trend at the regional level. So we also check whether there was any pre-trend. So this was like one way to see this. So we found that there were almost like no pre-trend before the change, because here we divide the two groups. We divide the provinces into two groups. This one is like the control group without curfew changes, and these are the groups with curfew changes. And you see that before this period, when a lot of curfew changes actually happened, they were actually moving very similarly, but afterwards, actually, they kind of diverged. Okay. And then this is about relevance, and the other one is like exclusion restrictions. Here, basically the idea is that who goes to Hagwon late night, and we look at like the fraction of students who by like their last attending time here, and you see that actually the people who go to Hagwon very late night we're talking about maybe like 20% of the total people. So we are not talking about a lot of people, right? A lot of students. But then if we look at this by income, by the father's income, for example, then those who attend the Hagwon very late night, there is a huge income gradient. So the kids from like much richer parents, they are more likely to go to Hagwon. Okay, and in other words, like the poor, the family's kids, like they are less likely to attend Hagwon at late night. So our so here our exclusion restrictions is we believe that this is more likely to be satisfied if we focus on relatively low income household in this variable, so that there is no direct impact of curfews on this, but the only impact, if any, is going to be through this regional effect. Okay, So that's basically the idea. And how do we define like low SES? And we use either like based on income or like based on education. Okay. So given that this table summarizes all the results. So here you see that I mean we can see that either low income or low education for the low SES, and but for each case we consider using like trend of the linear trend at the regional level, but also like year fixed effect. And here you see that in all cases, actually these estimates are positive, and also this range is actually relatively quite tight. So this number varies from like 0.04 to 0.09. So what does that mean? It means that if there was a 10% decrease in top 15% private education spending, this would lead to bottom 50%, this ratio of education spending to total expenditure to decrease by like 0.04 to 0.09 percentage point. Okay, and given that the mean was like about 6%, this number is, we argue that this number is quite economically meaningful as well. Okay, so this is like sort of like motivating evidence for our theoretical a model. So let me quickly introduce this model. I don't think I have time to show you like mathematical model, but I'm gonna briefly briefly describe the model. So this model is very simple. This is OLG model with endogenous fertility, but also there is endogenous investment, and fertility is a discrete choice like 0, 1, 2, 3. We abstract from interesting like a gender issue. So this is gonna be one gender model, and the parent children, they will overlap for only one period. Like one period is gonna be about 25 years. And although it's simple, we want to have a model that replicates like the cross-sectional and also joint distribution of the key variables like human capital, investment, and also like fertility. Like these are key variables. We want to have a model that generates realistic correlation between these key variables. So to do that, we introduce several layers of heterogeneity. So the first one is the parental human capital. So this is going to be like essentially wage. Okay? And this is endogenous heterogeneity. We also have a preference heterogeneity, which is exogenous heterogeneity. So some parents will care more about their own consumption relative to kids, for example. And we also have a children's learning ability, which will generate wage dispersion. Okay, and so this is going to be also persistent over time. And production is going to be based on like this aggregate efficiency units of labor, which will just summarize like their human capital and labor supply. Okay, and production technology, we have this kappa is going to be like this learning ability, which is persistent across generation. And there is like some baseline human capital, and this X is going to be investment made by parents. And so this will affect the children's human capital. And when this H prime will become their own productivity when they become adult. Okay, so the model will move in this way. And here the utility, I want to spend a bit of time on this utility, because this is where our the key ingredient comes in. So this utility depends on like consumption and leisure, which is quite standard. But in addition, we have this utility from number of kids, and also the utility from quality of children. This H prime is essentially the key quality from parent perspective, right? So here, but here the quality is not just their own children's quality, but there is like a negative utility coming from this like benchmark human capital in the children's generation. Okay, so if this becomes larger, then actually utility as a parent will decrease. So this is like how we capture this status externality in education. And as you may notice, this functional form is quite similar to this, like the Yum and Ulich, like who applied this sort of externality in a different application, like consumption externality. Okay, here in our case, the benchmark is different because this is not about like their own consumption, like their own past consumption, which is a catching of agencies, or it can be also they can compare themselves to like their neighborhood, like this will be like keeping of agencies. Like in this case, the parents they compare their kids to their future, like their kids generation. Okay, so there's timing difference. Also, the variable is human capital instead of consumption. So then the important question is like, what could be origin of this comparison motive? So which is not very important in our study because we use like this reduced form way of modeling this externality. But the origin can be, we argue that this can be originated from like maybe Korean people generally, they like to compare themselves to others, or it could be like Korean school system that encourages parents to compare their kids to others, like because as you might know, in Korea, the relative standing is actually very important, unlike all like European countries, European schools. So those features also, like importantly, the national and college entrance exam is also heavily like the relative standing is very important, right? So all these things will lead to this feature we model here, okay? But we don't actually dig into like the source in this paper.
So
Okay.
Minchul, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, yeah. So given that we because we want to conduct quantitative analysis, we calibrate this model to this cliff data I showed you. Okay, so basically our idea is to calibrate our model so that our model generates realistic like Gini income, like cross-sectional distribution, but also like how fertility is related to income, right? And also like how like the income is correlated across generation, etc. Right? So these are all targets, but most importantly, one of the most important variables here, the target is here, like a degree of externality. So remember in this utility function, there's a degree of externality. So we try to estimate this by targeting this education investment spillover effect we estimated using the instrument. Okay, so that's a thing, and then we also showed our model generates like sort of realistic this pattern of fertility across income distribution. And let me quickly introduce what we do using this model. So first exercise is to investigate what will happen if we shut down externality. Okay, so this is very counterfactual exercise. So when we shut down externality, we find that so fertility will become higher. So it will become actually quite higher, like 20x%. Okay, but more importantly, this increase, this red is like when there's no externality, and this is the baseline. And here you see that the increase is much higher for the low-income families, right? And then why is this happening? When we look at this investment per child relative to income, then you see that when we shut down externality, they actually invest a lot higher, like substantially higher, and a higher fraction of their income into private education in the baseline model as in the data. But when we shut down externality, actually this ratio goes down the most at the bottom of the income distribution, which will relax like financial burden of having another kid. And then you see that actually fertility will actually increase the most at the bottom of the income distribution. Okay, so this suggests that status externality in our baseline model plays a role of lowering the fertility especially among the low income families, right? So given that, in the second set of policy exercises, what we are going to do is to take this externality as given and then consider like more standard policy tools to address externality. The first one is pronatal transfers. This is like child allowance or like a baby bonus. Okay, so like some cash transfers to a newborn kids. The other form of policy is like education tax, because this is kind of the way to capture like a government's effort to dampen the education investment. Like the one way is like this kind of curfews, right? And also, I mean, the speed of PIGU, I mean, taxes on education in our case is a kind of a natural candidate, right? Because that's kind of a source of the inefficiency in our model. So we consider these two. This is more like a positive analysis, how they affected like fertility and education. Actually, their effect are qualitatively similar. They will both increase fertility while reducing investment per kid. Okay, but quantitatively their effects are different. Okay, and then the last exercise we do is a normative question, like what would be the optimal thing to do, like using these two policy tools. Okay, so then like there are some like layers like welfare analysis challenges, like for example, because we have heterogeneity, so a lot of these type of government policies, they have a redistribution gains, like welfare gains from redistribution, but those are, I mean, we are not interested in those. So to remove those gains, we use like this specific welfare wage called like negation wage, which will try to remove this redistributive motive. Also, we not just look at like the steady state effect, we also look at whole transition. Okay, and then lastly, we are going to, because Pareto, I mean, we are going to focus on the parent generation only, because it's kind of tricky to compare two different allocations where population is different, right? Also, the Pareto efficiency is kind of is actually not well defined in those cases. So we are going to end up using objective function for the welfare analysis, where we weight different people using this negation wage, not equal wage. And then we focus only on the first generation when the policy is introduced. Okay, and then what we found is that optimal policy is a combination of 2% education tax and like moderately large pronatal transfers. So which is about like 2.5% of average income for like 18 years. So this is much larger than what Korea had like several years ago, but actually Korea is already moving towards this type of like sizable child allowance, but this is still smaller than what Germany is doing, for example. Okay, and we have like this heterogeneous effects, which shows that actually this optimal policy, the effect is actually quite similar qualitatively to the world without like set externality, but given that we have a limit, we consider limited policy tool, quantitatively, we don't go up to the world without externality. All right, so I think I spent already all the time, so let me quickly summarize. So in this paper, we explore this new mechanism linking education fever with low birth rate. So here in our model, we consider a case where parents, they care about relative quality of children. And then we use this model to show that without the externality we identify from our baseline model, fertility will be much higher, but this effect is gonna be even higher among the low-income families. And then if it is like something we can't fix in the short run, we try to find optimal policy given that, and then we found that the optimal policy that maximizes welfare of the first generation is kind of mix of education, tax, and some sizable pronatal transfers. And the source of, as I said, the source of this externality is very important, but we don't actually investigate too much about this, but we actually present some alternative model where this externality is modeled differently Okay, but I think there should be further work on this source of this externality in the future. Okay? So thank you very much for listening, and yeah, sorry for spending a bit more time.
Thank you so much to Minchul for presenting this very rich paper within the 30 minutes. I know that it has been a quite challenging job. But at the same time, so it motivates us to read the paper and then at the same time ask the question during the Q&A time. So again, if you have any questions, please leave your questions on the Q&A box below on the Zoom menu. The Minki, the floor is now yours.
Okay, Minchul, can you stop sharing your screen? Right. Okay, so yeah, thank you, Minchul, for the great talk, and thanks, Moonsop and Steph, for giving me a chance to discuss this excellent paper. I have a very few little light touches because it's a very completed paper and already in a very great place. So just to quickly summarize the paper, so the background of this paper is low birth rate and the education fever in South Korea. And what this paper is really bringing the new in the literature is this concept of status externality in the framework of the fertility. So in my language, it's like the parents value the education of their children relative to the education of the other children. So even though you're putting a lot of resources in the education of your child, if your neighbor is putting more resources than you, and if your neighbor's child is better than your child, then you still want to invest in your kids further, which creates a giant rat race in the economy. And from the social planner's perspective, it kind of creates a big coordination failure where everyone over-invests in their children's human capital. So they embed this mechanism in the OLG model with the endogenous fertility. And to quantify the magnitude of this mechanism, they bring this very clever IB design where they use the regional variation of the curfews of Hagwon, which are kind of a private cram school in Korea for a high school or the college education entrance exam. They find that lower private education spending among the rich families, which are most affected by the policy. And if you see that your neighbor's kids have lower education spending, then they find that even though you want to lower your education spending, so if your neighbor's kid is not going to Hagwon, then you don't want to send your kids to Hagwon because you can't now. So with this calibrated model, they entertain some policy options with baby bonus and the education taxation, and their optimal policy is about 22% education taxation, and some moderated prenatal transfer can increase the fertility. But at the same time, they lower the future generation's human capital, which kind of creates some intergenerational conflicts. So my first discussion is about the curfew. So believe it or not, back in 2009, when this curfew was taking place, I was a high school student. So I can vividly remember how this curfew was implemented. So I don't question the exogenity of this curfew. My question is more were this private education after 10 p.m. really improving students' human capital? So the long-run welfare result and the intergenerational result about the human capital, basically the result that the future generation suffer from the loss of human capital, is hinging on the assumption that these excess education investment is actually producing human capital. But perhaps there are some studies that this 10 p.m. curfew is actually giving students more sleeping hours, and maybe their physical health, which is another dimension of human capital, made it improved. So perhaps if this excess education after 10 p.m. was just producing some signaling input for the college or the high school education, then well, maybe the long-run welfare result and the loss of human capital might be gone. So we might actually have a better policy outcome. The second point is about the optimal policy. So reading the paper, I was wondering why the authors have not entertained the option of the progressive taxation. So in the policy counterfactual section, the education taxation is introduced as a flat tax rate. So lower income household and the high income household, they face the same tax rate in the education spending. And this is I believe is one of the sources that leads to the long run increase in inequality. And I was wondering if the reference point for your status externality is the average human capital of the top 15%. So you're kind of aspiring the human capital of the high achieving kids, then shouldn't the progressive taxation or even the education subsidy to the bottom, like the X% of the student, be more effective? Because like if we take the status externality as given and try to minimize distortion, then maybe like making these students in the distribution closer to each other might be one way to reduce the aggregate distortion. And actually, if you look at the PISA score and look at the like a disparity between top and bottom percentile students in PISA score in 2000 and 2018, then this education disparity among Korean students have been increasing over time. The math score has been diverging and the reading score has been diverging. So actually, if you can introduce some progressive taxation here, then this inequality result of the optimal taxation can now actually be changing, I think. Like, of course, these are not like a criticism to the paper. These are more like the things that I would have liked to see. These are not even a discussion. I have some additional thoughts. Like, this is a very thought-provoking paper. So as Minchul already mentioned many times, like this paper is kind of silent about the origin of the statistic technology, like whether it's a deep-rooted cultural thing or is it just something artifact from the environment of the education system in Korea. I think it's worth thinking about like where this statistic technology is coming from. I mean, there are some literature saying that in East Asian countries, the long like institutional feature in the history about like civil service examination or like some meritocratic society environment leads to higher competition and even higher education attainment today. And this was a paper in the context of China, but given that like lots of East Asian countries share the same cultural history, it might be also be the case in like other East Asian countries. That's like one reason to think about this status technology coming from some deep cultural thing. The other thing is that actually when early 2010s, if you look at that period of time, that was the time because the authors are focusing on the parents of the middle school students. This was the time when the competition for the special purpose high schools in the entire country was particularly fierce. If you look at the acceptance rate of those like special purpose high school, basically the private high school with selecting student with examination, the acceptance rate like back in 2009 was about 23%. Nowadays, these are like a 77%. So maybe this like environment or the like how the education system is structured back then, like might have exacerbated or like facilitated this status externality, even though the paper is kind of modeling in a reduced way. So based on, I was thinking that based on where this status externality is coming from, maybe the external validity of this mechanism to like a more recent younger cohorts might be different. So if it's coming from the very persistent cultural root, then this mechanism might be able to might be applicable for the even younger cohorts who show even lower fertility rate, or if it's just artifacts from some recent education policy, which like education policy has been changing like very frequently in Korea, then like maybe different cohorts and different like a generation might have different mechanism. And just because Professor Hwang is here, I'm just going to show you this figure. This is the cohorts that the paper used. And if you look at the even younger generation, their fertility rate is even lower. So I would like to like see more research on this. And like one thing I learned while reading this paper is one of the data set that this paper used, the Korean General Social Survey, has been accumulated like over 20 years now. So it provides some good pictures of rapidly changing social norms in Korea. So I think it's a valuable avenue for the future research. So to conclude, I think it's a fascinating paper with a novel mechanism, and it's a big advancement in the literature of the fertility-income relationship. I really like the fact that this paper is bringing in something that's been studied in other disciplines of the social science in the realm of economics. And if this is a gold standard quantitative framework, it has a model with IV baked in, and also has like reduced form IV empirical evidence with convincing IV scheme. And it also simulates the IV directly in the model to estimate and discipline the model's parameters. And I'm excited to see a paper like this, like which use the Korean data and draw broader implications. And I love to see research like this in the future. I have some minor comments, but for the sake of time, I'm gonna just end here to facilitate more discussion from the Q&A session.
Thank
Thank
you
you very
so
much.
much, Minki. So could you stop sharing your screen? All right, so let's collect a few questions and then I will give a time to Minchul to respond both to Discussant and then several questions we collect. So the panelists could just raise your hand or just jump in if you have any questions. Steph, go ahead.
Well, I'm not an economist, so let me preface about that. But I think it might be interesting to dissect a little bit more the source of this status externality, because it seems to me that it's not in education spending per se, and it's not even in the relationship between educational investment and human capital, but it's connected with admissions to elite high schools and universities. And so what you're really competing for is the chance in this lottery, which then has big, labor market effects, right? Is that the correct way of thinking about this status externality? And if so, it raises another possible policy instrument, though I don't think any Korean would like it, which is not in subsidies to, not in pro-natalist policies or education taxes, but in somehow weakening the relationship between hagwon spending and likelihood of admission into high status high schools and colleges. I mean, should that link be broken? For example, by having more progressive admissions policies, which saying, we're going to take more low-income students, for students from more low-income households, regardless of their examination scores.
All right, the more questions? Jungmin, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add one more thing about the origin of this status externality, and the Stefan mentioned admission policies. In fact, in Korea, the students are admitted based on the relative positions within schools. That's very important. So locally, this actually makes the competition very fierce within schools, even within classrooms. So I think that could be it's not the preference. It's it could be the material source of this comparison, relative comparison, and high competition. And one more thing, I think that probably the Jisoo will mention this, but in your model, there is no female labor supply and maternal labor supply concern. I think that is also pretty much related to this phenomenon, low fertility rate. So, and your baseline fertility rate is like 1.9, but we are now like below 1. So I think from 2 to 1 to below 1 are very different stories. So I think your story may explain the fertility rate around 2, but maybe we need another model to explain the why fertility goes below 1. This is really crazy. Yeah, that's it.
So Jisoo, yeah.
Okay. Well, first, I really liked your presentation. I was actually very curious about your paper, but I wanted to ask you about how I think a very important part of your empirical work is that you restrict the sample to married women. I think that's a very important piece to the empirical work, because if you look at all women or all adults in general, I don't think you would see that clear negative relationship between income and fertility, in the sense that still in Korea, the highly educated men and women are the ones who are, the highly educated women are the ones who are less likely to be married in the first place. So once you don't restrict the sample to just married women, you wouldn't see a clear negative relationship, because the high income women are just not getting married and also not having any children at all. So I was wondering, once you take into account that extensive margin, how the interpretations could change. And I think it's also related to what Jungmin just mentioned, how the effect of this education externality may be overstated in a sense by focusing on these households who are already married and in that sense already kind of jumped over that extensive margin barrier. So if you also consider that extensive margin, like another very huge piece to the low fertility in Korea could be related to, women's work family incompatibility and, other factors like that. So of course, your paper is not about explaining low fertility in Korea in general, and you're focusing on the education part, but I was still wondering how that restriction, the sample restriction, plays a part in your analysis.
Okay, we have one more question coming from the audience. The Youngdu Che, left the question on the Q&A box, and it is about the optimal policy. So your paper targets the first generation utility, but shouldn't we care the latter, which is the lifetime household welfare, if there is a trade-off between the generations? And the second related question is, does the fertility income, the relationship becomes the negative under the optimal policy? Because he was wondering if the externality is the main source of the positive relationship in Korea. So sorry that we give you only less than 5 minutes to respond. So we don't expect that you are going to answer to all the questions. You can choose a few questions and answer to those.
Okay, so thank you. First of all, thank you all very much for all the comments, and especially Minki, who gave very generous assessment of the paper. I really appreciate it. So to answer this last minute question about this, whether this effect on whether the status externality is actually playing a role of explaining this income fertility relationship, I think that's the interpretation we wrote in the paper. So that is correct. But when it comes to the long run effect, which was part of the Minki's discussion point, actually in the paper, we actually carefully argue that the long run effect, the negative long run effect on the future generation based on optimal policy that is only based on the first generation should be taken with some grain of salt, because that's actually heavily based on our assumption on how effective this the investment is on the human capital accumulation. So in our baseline model, this private education is purely productive, but you can think of, we talk about signaling, for example. So if there are two different type of human capital where the other one is not productive, then our long run effect on the future generation is gonna be actually much different. Okay, so so that's why we don't want to highlight too much about this the effect on future generation. Okay, that's kind of there's something I couldn't highlight during the presentation. But then about the source, actually, so coming to Jesus' questions about this, what happens to this income fertility relationship when we include the other samples we dropped. Actually, this relationship we found that the relationship became more positive because first of all, the reason why we excluded those samples is because it wasn't clear to us how to insert this income from single member family. Because should we just insert that as its name or its value, or should we divide the two members' income by 2, right? Average or total? And if we think about economic status, then maybe just sum is better. So if we do that, then actually income fertility relationship becomes even more positive. So here actually we are kind of more conservative by dropping them, but actually we are just dropping 3% of our sample. So we suppose that because we are looking at this clip sample, which are probably more stable, but also we are looking at these people who were born in 1970s. So I guess that these are the things that make these results, like that makes this sample very small. Like majority of families are quite stable. But then, as you already know, like there has been huge change in Korean demographic system. So the structure, so like the marriage rate has been also dropped a lot, like in recent periods, right? So our paper is probably, I mean, we need like additional work on like a source of fertility that also highlights these features as well. So I guess like there are also recent papers that highlight like marriage, the role of marriage, but also I also have a different paper that highlights more on like a labor supply a woman, like a man, like separately, and what's the impact of, for example, more family-friendly policies on fertility, for example. So I guess like in the literature, more people are working on these recently highlighted features also in macro as well, I think. So yeah, and then I like to.
So you have 1 minute, so you may choose one question and answer to that.
Okay. So about the source of the status externality, I find that the people who are based in the U.S. tend to believe that this what we model should be mostly based on like college entrance competition, and then in that case there will be like different ways to address this kind of externality. For example, you can increase capacity as well, right? So, I mean, you can increase the slot. Like there's another possibility. So that's why we actually consider different model that tries to microfound this set externality using college competition. That's in our section like 8 or 9. But I mean, what we wanted to highlight is that there's more than that. So because in Korea, on top of this college competition, there are other different ways that can justify this externality behavior. And actually, there's also empirical evidence that the East Asian people are generally more likely to compare themselves to the others. So there is like this more fundamental differences in terms of comparison motive. So I mean, so that's why we didn't try to take a clear stance on the source of externality. But we still believe that like investigating the source of externality is actually very important topic for the future research.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
sorry for the
you
rush.
know that I hate this role of the managing the time, but it is already the time to wrap up today's event. So thank you so much, Minchul, for introducing your thought-provoking paper, and then the Minki for the useful discussion. So I would like to second what Minki said. So it is very exciting to see the paper using the Korean data, studying the Korean economy, but at the same time, making the broad implication toward the other countries. So along with the co-organizer, Professor Jung-min Lee, so SNU, the UC San Diego series, aims to cover introduce those papers at the early stage, the late stage. So we will meet again in the spring the next year. So stay tuned. Thank you so much for joining. Bye-bye.